Here's one of the things that those who teach a pre-tribulation rapture cite as evidence of the rapture occurring before the 7-year tribulation period begins. The questions and concerns being raised by the church in Thessalonica that Paul was addressing in the book of 1 Thessalonians 4 and 2 Thessalonians 2 indicate that Paul had taught a pre-tribulation rapture when he was there in person, and that they are currently being mistaught something else besides a pre-tribulation rapture. The very questions they're struggling with indicate the early church was expecting a pre-tribulation rapture. The answers from Paul indicate that this is true. What Paul's answers actually indicate is that the early church was expecting to be raptured prior to the day of the Lord occurring, not the tribulation period. If there's one thing that those who believe in pre-tribulation rapture miss, is that there is a distinct difference between tribulation and God's wrath. The day of the Lord is synonymous with God's wrath and judgment, but God's wrath is not synonymous with the tribulation period. Much of what happens during the tribulation period described during Jesus' Olivet Discourse, Paul's writings, and the books of Daniel and Revelation take place prior to God's wrath being poured out on the inhabitants of the earth. God's always in control, but much of the bad stuff that happens during the tribulation has to do with natural calamities, economic crisis, and comes at the hands of the Antichrist. All of that precedes the outpouring of God's wrath. Thank God that Jesus does return and gather his saints sometime during the second half of the tribulation period, prior to the day of the Lord occurring. This is completely consistent with what Paul said in his letter to the Thessalonians. Don't be shaken or alarmed that the day of the Lord has come. Why? Because that day won't come until the signs Paul had previously taught them about would occur first. What are those signs? Paul said there'd be a falling away from the faith, and the revealing of the Antichrist would take place, which is an event that Jesus and the prophet Daniel referred to as the abomination of desolation. These are signs that the church will be around to see. Yet, because they're not appointed to suffer God's wrath that will take place during the day of the Lord, the church will be raptured prior to the terrible events of God's wrath that are described in the book of Revelation chapters 8 through 19. Those events take place during the last part of the last half of the 7-year tribulation period. How could Jesus' return or the rapture of the church be imminent and unexpected if we have specific signs to watch for? Well, first, because we don't know when the 7-year period will kick off in the future. Secondly, even when that 7-year clock starts ticking, for those who are not deceived or caught sleeping and recognize it anyway, we won't know when the rescue of the church will come during the second half of the tribulation period. In this way, the church will know the season they're in because of the signs, but not the day nor the hour of Christ's return. They will have the assurance and biblical hope of an imminent rescue amidst persecution. Paul's teaching to the church was nothing new. Being an apostle means that he was sent by Jesus on Jesus' behalf to teach what would be consistent with what Jesus had already taught. Paul's teaching fits so well with what Jesus taught that he might have in fact arrived at his teaching by learning what Jesus taught to his 12 original disciples about the second coming. What did Jesus teach during his Olivet Discourse? The same thing as Paul. There would be a great falling away from the faith, great persecution, the Antichrist would be revealed, his elect would be gathered during the rapture event, and only then would the wrath of God take place. Paul was reconfirming for the church in Thessalonica that persecution, trials, and tribulation are not synonymous with the day of the Lord. Paul did this because they were troubled and had confused the persecution they were experiencing at that time with it being associated with the day of the Lord. They had made the same mistake as many are making today. They failed to recognize that suffering, tribulation, and persecution are not synonymous with the day of the Lord. You know, if Paul's teaching found in the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians just stood on its own, you wouldn't know anything about the 7-year tribulation period. We just don't know if Paul taught them anything about that or not. Information regarding the time frame of the tribulation period is found in the books of Daniel and Revelation. It's Jesus that ties the 7-year tribulation period of time into his second coming. He does that during his Olivet Discourse, and you can read that in Matthew chapter 24. What you get from Paul's teachings, if they stand alone, is that there will be signs that the church will be around to witness. One of those will be what he calls a falling away, and the other is the revealing of the Antichrist. These things will occur at an unspecified time prior to the day of the Lord occurring. Further, Paul teaches that the church will be saved from going through the day of the Lord. They'll be saved from this by being raptured. The great news in all this is that the pre-tribulationists are absolutely correct in that God's elect will not suffer the outpouring of his wrath on the earth. However, there is absolutely no scriptural basis to say that the church will not be around to experience persecution at the hand of the Antichrist. That is simply a false teaching. The most important thing to remember here is that there is a difference between the persecution of the church at the hands of the Antichrist and the events that take place during the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is synonymous with God's wrath and judgment, and that's poured out on the earth only after the church has been raptured. Thank you, and God bless.